Hey everyone, it's Jamie. Mark Carney and the Liberals have added one more MP to their ranks with a Conservative floor crosser on Wednesday, Edmonton MP Matt Genereux. If they keep 2 ridings and win back a third in upcoming by-elections, they will have their majority. So it was a pretty big day on Parliament Hill. If they keep 2 ridings and win back a third in upcoming by-elections, they will have their majority. So it was a pretty big day on Parliament Hill. Aaron Wary is here to talk through how this could all play out for the Liberals, but also importantly for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. So let's get straight to it. Aaron, hi.
Hey, Jamie.
Another very eventful day.
Yeah, another quiet day in Ottawa.
Yeah. You and I are talking at 3 p.m. One more floor crosser for the Liberals. As I just mentioned, Matt Genereux's name is probably pretty familiar to some people listening. People actually thought he was going to cross in the fall, right? But he didn't, and he said he was going to resign and step away from politics this spring, and then he pretty much went kind of AWOL after that, right?
Yeah, he released a statement back in November that said he was going to resign. It wasn't clear exactly when. The spring was sort of floated as a possibility.
Not giving a direct reason for his resignation, but saying he ran in the last election hopeful that Canadians would put faith in a team led by Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives, and added he wanted desperately to play a role in that vision. He then goes on to say he has confidence in all those elected on both sides of the aisle, and he hopes for another chance to address the House of Commons, but for the moment, his focus will be on his family. The letter does not.
We do know that he had met with Mark Carney at some point before he announced he was going to resign. His name would come up in the speculation about potential Conservative floor crossers, that there was this sort of rush of speculation in the fall after Pierre Poilievre made some, I guess you could say, controversial comments about the RCMP and Justin Trudeau's government.
If the RCMP had been doing its job and not covering up for him, then he would have been criminally charged. The leadership of the RCMP is frankly just despicable when it comes to enforcing laws against the Liberal government.
And Matt Genereux's name had come up in those discussions, but after he put that statement out announcing that he was going to resign, that seemed to kind of be the end of it. There'd been a subsequent statement that said there was no coercion involved in his decision to resign, but he wasn't much of a presence on Parliament Hill, regardless of whether he had or had not resigned. It seemed, for all intents and purposes, that he was kind of out of the picture at that point.
Yeah.
And I guess until this morning.
How are you, Matt? Thanks for coming. Good to be in Edmonton. Yeah. Always great to be in Edmonton, the city of champions here.
So let's talk about how he got here then, deciding to not resign and then to actually cross the floor to the Liberals. Carney actually flew to Edmonton on Wednesday for a previously unadvertised trip to the province, and he welcomed Genereux to the party with open arms. He seemed pretty happy, and both men spoke a bit.
Listen, this is a great day for Edmonton, great day for Alberta and for Canada, and thank you very much for coming and joining the team at a crucial time for the city, the province, and the country.
So I had announced my resignation back in November, largely due to the family reasons, but quite simply couldn't sit on the sidelines after seeing what the Prime Minister was, the ambitious agenda he was undertaking across the country and across the world.
And just what kind of insights did we gain from information that came out through the day?
So we know a couple things. First, we know that Matt Genereux told Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, and the Conservative leadership about a minute before Mark Carney's statement came up. So this was a pretty sudden announcement.
Oof.
In his comments with Mark Carney in Edmonton, Genereux pointed to a couple things. First, he pointed to the Davos speech that Mark Carney had given as a kind of crystallizing moment for him.
That's where a lot of the world changed. I think it opened a lot of eyes for Canadians, Albertans, Edmontonians, just how serious this national unity crisis truly is. And it's for me, it felt disingenuine and quite simply wrong to be sitting on the sidelines anymore. So I reached out to the Prime Minister's office, and will be joining his caucus, and I couldn't be more proud to.
Mark Carney has specified or has kind of emphasized this idea that it's time for people to come together. So I think they're sort of fitting into that narrative of conservatives crossing the floor to work with the Liberals, because that fits with this moment in Canadian history. We don't know a ton yet, though, about what exactly transpired between November and now, so far as, what discussions may have happened behind closed doors. I suspect we'll find out more about that in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I saw Melanie Joly scrumming earlier in the day. She did say that, as she understood it, there had been kind of these ongoing conversations.
Well, I know there were a number of conversations in recent weeks, but the decision was up to MP Généreux, and I'm glad he made the right decision.
Généreux actually mentioned that he reached out to them, right? Kind of after the Davos speech, which I thought was kind of an interesting tidbit. And we'll get to Poilievre more in a bit, but I felt like maybe it's worth noting here. Généreux also released a statement this morning, and just when I was parsing through it, it did strike me that he didn't take any kind of direct swipes at Poilievre, right? It was really much like his comments during the presser, all about, why he wanted to go to the Liberals. And that's not what we heard really from Nova Scotia MP Chris d'Entremont, who crossed the floor to the Liberals in the fall. He talked about essentially how he didn't like Poilievre's negative approach to politics.
Yeah, d'Entremont was quite strong on that, particularly in subsequent interviews, talking about...
Quite honestly, a lot of times I felt it was a part of a frat house rather than a serious political party. It wasn't about keeping government to account. It wasn't about trying to do the best for your constituents. It was about tearing down.
Even Michael Mall, when he left in December, I believe he, talked, there was sort of an oblique reference to this not being the time for division.
Instead of deepening division of the country, I believe that we are better served when we are with the governing party to be able to help voice our decisions and support the constituents in a much better fashion.
So it is interesting that Matt Généreux didn't make a kind of explicit statement about Pierre Poilievre. I can only really speculate about why that might be. I mean, he has praised Poilievre in the past, so it might be particularly hard for him to criticize Poilievre now. I think we'll have to wait and see whether he gives subsequent interviews where he talks, where he's inevitably going to be asked about whether this has something to do with Pierre Poilievre's leadership. I mean, I think regardless, even if he hasn't criticized Poilievre, his actions speak louder than anything, right?
Yeah.
This is still going to be taken as a reflection on Poilievre's leadership, regardless of whether or not Matt Généreux made that explicit.
Généreux was given the post of a special advisor on economic and security partnerships. Not a cabinet position, but certainly some extra responsibilities. What did you make of that?
I mean, I think it's, an interesting addition to what's happened here. We'll see what it, turns into exactly. I think if you're Mark Carney and you're mindful of national unity and you don't have a ton of Alberta MPs, giving one some extra responsibility, some extra prominence probably doesn't hurt. But we'll see sort of what it amounts to in terms of, substance, I guess, kind of in the weeks and months to come.
All right, so this is now the third Conservative MP to cross to the Liberals. We've talked about the other two already, Chris d'Entremont, Michael Mall. And the Liberals could now get a majority without any more floor crossers. So this is big. Explain the current state of play to me.
Yeah, sure. So this, there is math involved. It's a bit complicated. At this moment, the Liberals have 169 MPs, and there are 171 opposition MPs. The sharp minds in our audience will note that that only adds up to 340. And that's because there are 3 vacancies currently in the House of Commons. One is a seat at University of Rosedale in downtown Toronto that previously belonged to Chrystia Freeland.
Freeland posted a statement on social media just now. Today, I've written to the Speaker to confirm that I will vacate my seat effective this Friday, January 9th. One of the roles I will be taking on is as an unpaid advisor. on economic issues to the president of Ukraine. This is a volunteer position. And
the second is Scarborough Southwest, that previously belonged to Bill Blair.
A longtime Liberal MP and cabinet minister is leaving the House of Commons and moving to London. Bill Blair has been appointed to be the next High Commissioner to the UK, replacing Ralph Goodale. Blair's departure will trigger another...
And then there is the curious case of Terrebonne, a riding near Montreal in Quebec. The first two ridings, University Rosedale and Scarborough Southwest, you would expect the Liberals to win those two ridings pretty easily. They've been safe Liberal seats for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So you can sort of add them to the Liberal total whenever those by-elections get called. That would bring it to 171 to 171. Then that brings us to Terrebonne. That riding is vacant because just last week, the Supreme Court essentially annulled the result in that election because after all the ballots were counted, it was determined that the Liberal candidate there had won by a single vote in last year's election. But subsequently, we learned that there were errors in at least some of the mail-in ballots.
The result was complicated when it was revealed Elections Canada made a mistake, having put the wrong address on some mail-in ballots. One woman came forward saying her vote for the Bloc Québécois was not counted. The Bloc candidate took the case all the way to the Supreme Court.
Democracy, the will of the people, should always be respected. That's what we heard today.
Now there will be
and the Supreme Court ruled pretty quickly that there needed to be a new election there. And so we're waiting at this point to see when exactly it will be called. But it's essentially a toss-up, almost the definition of a toss-up, given that it was decided by one vote last time.
Yeah.
And the result there could essentially determine whether the Liberals end up with a majority.
It's crazy. If the Supreme Court hadn't ruled that way, they would be kind of on their way likely to a majority right now. What is the latest polling telling us from that riding? Do we have any?
Well, I mean, the projections at this point still listed as a toss-up. You would think the Liberals have some reason to hope that they can at least repeat or improve on the result last year, just because the Liberals are doing so well nationally and have, essentially improved their standing over the past several months. So you would think that they have a pretty good shot there. And you would also have to assume that if the majority is a narrow majority, at least, is riding on that riding, they will expend no shortage of effort to try to win it.
And then also, they might not even need to wait for these by-elections to get to a majority too, right? Because there are these rumors, they're flying around right now that more floor crossings are coming. But also I say that with a caveat because we have, of course, seen these rumor mills get carried away before. I'm sure you have even more proximity to them than I do in Ottawa, Aaron. But if you are an MP thinking of crossing the floor right now, what are you weighing here?
So I think you're probably weighing a couple things. The first is, I think it's interesting to note that if you look at Chris D'Entremont, Michael Maw, and now Matt Genereux, yes, they were all Conservatives, but they were all in ridings where you can look at the result in the last election and say, oh, this is close enough that a Liberal could conceivably win in this riding. And so I imagine that if you're in a riding where you can imagine a Liberal winning, where there was, a Liberal who finished a close second, or where current polls suggest that a Liberal could win, you're that much more likely to consider possibly crossing over to the Liberals. I imagine there's also some sort of personal interest in, is this going to give you a bigger profile? Is this going to give you, some kind of job in government, parliamentary secretary, cabinet minister, something like that. You may have some leverage at this point. If the Liberals are this close to a majority, they may be that much more interested in trying to persuade you to cross the aisle. I think the other part of it, of course, is, if you're a Conservative MP and you have misgivings about Pierre Poilievre's leadership, you have to, I assume now that the Conservative Party has stood behind him. He got 87% in the leadership review. He doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. And so, maybe that also has some kind of bearing on your decision.
This is obviously very bad news for him, right? Like, I know he had a good week the other week with the 87.4%, but I mean, this is not good. 3 MPs leaving your party.
No, it's not good.
Yeah.
It's hard to know if there's a tipping point out there where things really start to move against him. I mean, I think his position gets more precarious with each person who leaves. I mean, you have to note that lots of Conservative MPs went out on social media today and condemned what Matt Genereux did. And from the outside, I can imagine that, a defection like this could serve to sort of galvanize the remaining MPs behind Poilievre, at least in the short term. But yeah, his position becomes just a bit more difficult each time an MP leaves because it raises all the questions and doubts. It creates all sorts of bad headlines. You start to wonder whether this will have any impact on or further impact on the Conservative Party's polling numbers overall. And it gets the Liberals that much closer to a majority. And if the Liberals have a majority, then you're suddenly looking at, a Carney government being in place with, not quite a free hand, but a pretty strong hand to implement its agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And it just changes the horizon on everything. So I do think if you're a Conservative MP, you look at the 87% and say, well, at the very least, the leadership review isn't going to be the thing that triggers a leadership change. And it's not nothing that 87% of members support Pierre Poilievre. And so, yes, his position is not super rock solid, but it also doesn't look like he's going to be changed. It doesn't look like the Conservative Party is going to make a change in leadership next week.
To lose 3, I mean, floor crossing isn't new, right? Leona Alslev in 2018 went from the Liberals to the Conservatives. Belinda Stronach in 2005 very dramatically crossed to the Liberals and ended her relationship with Peter MacKay in the process.
You were with Ms. Stronach just prior to her meeting with the Prime Minister. Tell me about that time.
Well, as I said, I just didn't see it coming. I spent a lot of time with her and her children over the last number of months, and so it hurts.
Have we ever seen this many in a matter of months? Is there a historical precedent here?
I don't think there is a very good historical precedent for this. I mean, there have definitely been sort of multiple defections at a time, cabinet ministers leaving governments. Stockwell Day was the leader of the Canadian Alliance, and a whole chunk of that party sort of broke off. That was 2 decades ago. But there's never been, I don't know that there's ever been a situation like this where you've got, almost this steady drip of defections and a situation where the governing party is this close to a majority. And for Poilievre, it's, this is maybe obvious, but like losing 1, okay, maybe that happens. Losing 2, okay, that starts to look not so great.
Mm-hmm.
Each time another one leaves, I think it just compounds that idea. And in addition to the sort of parliamentary numbers and whatever it might mean for the caucus internally, I also wonder what it says, like whether the public registers that as a big problem and how much it weakens his hand going forward.
In a statement today, Poilievre, he said that Genereux had betrayed the people of Edmonton Riverbend, and then he also said that Mark Carney is trying to seize a costly Liberal majority government that Canadians voted against in the last election through dirty backroom deals. Former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney also expanded on this argument. In a post, he said that a Liberal has never been elected in Edmonton Riverbend Genereux's riding, and that this runs against the clear direction of his constituents. And I wonder, could this be a problem in the other direction, right? Like, do you think that messaging will resonate with Canadians?
I think Canadians in general take a somewhat dim view of floor crossers, although I think it depends on whether the person crossing the floor has benefited or hurt the party they voted for. And I think there is probably some risk to the Liberals of looking too cynical or too manipulative, or that they've done something kind of underhanded somehow if they get to a majority and it involves floor crossers.
Because Carney's story, I don't want to interrupt you, but like Carney's whole brand is that he's not a political animal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think he's showing himself to be somewhat of a political animal. I do think there is a risk. I don't know that it necessarily outweighs the potential benefits to the government. And I think if you're the government, you're probably saying it's worth the risk. But I do think there is, you probably don't want to look too triumphant about it. You probably don't want to look too gleeful as people cross the floor. Part of the problem for people, politicians who complain about floor crossing is realistically, no one's hands are clean here, right? Like, Jason Kenney saying, oh, I don't know about this could feel cynicism. It's like, okay, but Jason Kenney was there in 2006 when David Emerson from the Liberals crossed the floor and became a cabinet minister in Stephen Harper's government. And the NDP at the time said, oh, we need to ban floor crossing. Let's, bring in a law that says you can't do that. And Stephen Harper stood up in the House and said,
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, I believe members of Parliament should have that freedom to be accountable to their constituents for their decisions at the next election. But I will say this, Mr. Speaker, in my observation, the only parties that really have this as an obsession are the parties that no one ever crosses to.
In his experience, the only people who don't like floor crossing are the parties that don't benefit from it. And I think that's kind of true, is like everybody hates floor crossing when it happens to their side. But when it happens to benefit their side, well, then it's a courageous act of putting aside partisanship to work for the benefit of the country. So we'll see how the public reacts to it. And I do think there is a risk for the government, but I think it's just so hard for another partisan to criticize these actions because, again, it's just everybody's done it.
Okay, I take your point that Poilievre just won by a lot during his leadership review. But, I was also reading this piece by Globe and Mail columnist Andrew Coyne, and he wrote this even before the latest floor crosser news. And he is making the argument that Poilievre won over the rank and file members, but the party establishment is already making plans for his exit. And he puts this recent trip to Washington by Conservative MP Jamil Jivani up as an example of how Jivani is positioning himself as the next leader of the MAGA wing of the party. Jivani, for people listening, has been framing Canadians' reaction to Trump's attacks on the country as like a hissy fit.
We are shooting ourselves in the foot if we continue this anti-America, hissy fit. And this is the kind of reason I'm trying to talk into our government and some of the liberals.
Which is also a lot like how the Trump administration is framing it. And do you agree with Coyne there? Is this what you think is ultimately happening right now? They're starting to make moves.
I don't know that we're already into the end game stage of things. I do think it exposes a certain friction in the way we've built things, right? Like, Pierre Poilievre has won the support of the membership, but there is also a parliamentary caucus, and then there is also sort of, I guess you could call them conservative elites, right? Like strategists and people who work in the party or have worked in governments and so on. And none of them are necessarily beholden to the others, right? Caucus may take note of a membership vote and may say, oh, well, that shows that the people who vote for us, the people who support this party are behind Pierre Poilievre, but that doesn't necessarily bind the caucus to support Pierre Poilievre. I do think on Jamil Jivani in particular, it's interesting that he is making a lot of effort, it seems, to raise his own profile. I don't know whether that amounts to a leadership challenge at this point, but I do think, as we've seen, it does potentially raise problems for Poilievre because Jivani may go and do things or say things that Pierre Poilievre doesn't agree with and that he ends up having to disavow. And I think, whether or not it's leading to a full sort of schism in the party or a real leadership challenge, it adds to the things that Pierre Poilievre, if he is going to somehow hang on, ends up having to navigate.
Right. I mean, it's already a big problem for him, right? Like, he had to distance himself from Giovanni. I think on Tuesday he had to say that.
Well, he speaks for himself, and I speak for the party.
Do you think
Thank you.
And I saw Melanie Joly also kind of lean into this today too.
That Pierre Poilievre has to explain why his MP, Giovanni, went to Washington to basically say that the Trump tariffs were justified. So clearly he's not capable to control his caucus or to defend Canada's interests.
This does not sound like it's going away for him.
Yeah, 24 hours ago, we would have said the big problem for Pierre Poilievre this week is that Jamil Giovanni went to Washington, had these meetings, and then came back and criticized Canadians.
Yeah.
And said, Canadians were in the middle of an anti-American, quote unquote, hissy fit. And I think that has real potential, to register with Canadians in some respect, because I think Canadians probably would look at the situation and say they have real reasons to be concerned about what's going on in the United States, and their actions are not a hissy fit, but based on what's actually happening right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the fact that Giovanni did it and said what he said raises questions about how free does an MP like Giovanni feel to sort of speak his mind and do what he wants to do, and maybe say things that the party doesn't agree with. And it's a bit, look, most of the time the conversation around Parliament and around political parties is about how party leaders have too much power and we need to give MPs more power and they should be free to speak their mind and so on and so forth. And I think that's broadly true. The flip side of that is when they say things that party leader disagrees with or doesn't like, how does the party leader handle that? And is Giovanni somebody who is going to kind of discipline himself and not put the party in a difficult position? Or is he going to speak his mind regardless of what it means for the party? And it, Poilievre's sort of fighting it from both angles. One is, he's got MPs, now 3 MPs that have left, and then he's got, at least 1 MP inside caucus who's saying things that he has to renounce. And that's, it just sort of adds to the troubles that Poilievre is facing right now.
Okay. Aaron, thank you very much.
Anytime.
All right, that's all for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.